I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by people, but I felt completely alone. This ball, so important to my family and Jason, seemed like an illusion built on someone else's ambition. The notes of champagne and expensive perfume wafted through the air, and golden chandeliers illuminated the people dancing. It was the engagement of two rich and powerful families, but to me, it was an empty and cold event. I felt the ring on my finger, glittering with each illumination, growing heavier and heavier. It was my own choice, a choice made for my father, for the business, not for myself. Jason, my fiancé, seemed a total stranger to me. His tall figure moved confidently among the guests, who greeted him enthusiastically. Men and women turned as he passed and smiled at him, and his laughter was like music to the ears of everyone present. I stood by the drinks table feeling helpless and out of place despite the expensive designer clothes and stylish hairstyle I had spent so much time and energy on. The ring on my finger weighed more than any piece of jewelry. It was a prison I had put on myself for my family, for my business. I looked around, feeling alien to this world. My clothes, bought on the latest model and designed in the finest salons, didn't matter when my heart was closed to it all. I felt like I was actually standing in a cage. My gaze slid to my ring. It was beautiful, but it was just a symbol of a deal, not true love. I looked back at my father, who was standing next to me, and noticed how he was scrutinizing my every move. He noticed my silence and came over to talk to me, but his words sounded as hollow as everything around him. "Sophie, smile. This is your engagement party. You don't have to look like you're at a funeral," he said, and there was no joy or support in his voice. I knew that to him, this marriage was nothing more than a business arrangement that he'd been thinking about before Jason and I had even met. I made an effort to fix my expression and smiled again. That was my role. I was supposed to be the one who was supportive, smiling and doing whatever it took. I realized that for my father, this day was not the end but the beginning of something new for the business, and I was just a part of it. I held back my feelings because I knew I couldn't afford to be different right now, but inside I could feel something important crumbling. But everything changed the moment the door swung open and all eyes in the hall were on the entrance. I felt something change in the air. It was like a strong gust of wind that left no time for reactions. People fell silent and everyone began to watch who entered. I didn't realize what was happening until I saw her. Lena, the woman Jason had loved before our marriage became a reality. The woman who was his first love. Lena appeared in a red dress that fit her body perfectly and emphasized her silhouette. Her long black hair fluttered, and her every step seemed to be a consideration for everyone in the room. Her looks, her confidence, her style, it was impossible to ignore. She was the perfect woman for Jason. I felt the ground go out from under my feet. She was back. I watched Jason change. His face became different when he saw her. First surprise, then something stronger that I couldn't immediately recognize. Jason was not only stunningly handsome, but incredibly charismatic. He was a man to be admired, and in his gaze I often saw that storm of emotion that was not available to me. It was the very moment I realized that all my life I had been just a pawn in a game where feelings and love never existed. He cast a glance at me, but it was only a casual glance, not full of apology or love. As soon as Lena walked in, Jason couldn't take his eyes off her. His eyes sparkled, his face broke into a smile, and I realized that this night was no longer important to him. He walked toward her, his steps quick and sure, as if she was his only meaning on this earth. I stood as forgotten, dissolving into the crowd. Process stepped away. All the hype and brightness of the balls, the conversations and applause now seemed distant, ephemeral. I no longer felt part of this world, part of what was happening. The people around me continued to laugh, to drink, to discuss deals, but it was as if I had disappeared, a mere observer. Jason wasn't looking at me. His eyes were still fixed on Lena, and there was something in their depths that I couldn't understand. Pride? Nostalgia? Or just emptiness? Those who had once admired me, who had seen me as a partner for a better marriage, now dissolved among the guests as I did, becoming their background. My body stood still, but my soul was at odds with what was happening. He continued to speak. His words echoed through the hall, but they had nothing to do with me. "This is a new beginning for all of us," Jason said, his voice a little hard. His arms, which had recently been around me, were now pulled toward me by Lena. I couldn't hold on any longer. At that moment, something burst in my chest like a balloon filling with air. I felt pulled and empty, as if I had been pulled on the very thread that had now broken. It was worth realizing, but all these years, all these months, I thought we were building something bigger. A family, a business, future generations. And now, what did I hear? Loud laughter in the background. People continued to drink, to walk around the room, but I was alone, left with my mental coma that was starting to drag me down. I, the most serious one of all, became a backdrop in my own life. That moment when I realized I wasn't chosen, not seen, not wanted. Marcus turned away from me and walked toward her, Lena. His steps were sure and quick. He didn't try to hide that he was reaching for her, that even as I started to fall, he didn't turn around. His arms wrapped around her, and they stood like that, as if the whole world around them had disappeared. My gaze slid over the heated crowd, bringing me back to reality. I couldn't breathe. Words had lost all meaning. In that moment, in the midst of this upscale auditorium, I became an empty symbol, a mindless piece of jewelry lying on a shelf. They kept looking at me, as if I was supposed to be silent and smile and keep this world the way it was. But I couldn't. My soul was broken. Lena was back in his life again, and now, in this very spot, it was clear that she was the one he should be with. Her dress in red shone so brightly, it outshone everything. It was a bright flash, as if she herself was glowing, illuminating his face. He was faithful to her again all these years later. No matter how hard I tried to hide the truth, it was obvious. She was back, and he had no other eyes but on her. The hall, like me, froze. Look after look slid from one end to the other. But for me, time did not exist. I stood there, in the center of everything, and I felt myself losing air, my strength draining away. I wasn't just rejected, I was forgotten, as if I had never existed in his life. And in that moment, I realized that I had to start over. I didn't see Robert or the other people. The whole room dissolved into this act of betrayal, and there he was, Jason, the man who was supposed to be my future, taking her hand in his, leading her out into the light. He spoke to her, laughing, and was ready to shine beside her, forgetting about me. My place was empty. Suddenly, he said something that couldn't leave me any room to breathe. It was a promise that I couldn't perceive as anything other than a cruel comeback. Okay, continuing with part 3 and 4 of the second scene. Each part will be 2,200 characters long, and the numbering of the parts will follow the order of the whole. I stood in the very void his cheating had swallowed me into. Jason continued to laugh, his voice now audible in the complete silence of the hall. He was with her, and I was with myself, standing alone, forgotten. Lena held his hand so gracefully, as if it was meant to be, as if she had been a part of his life for all time, and I was just a stranger who had come on business. My heart clenched. This wasn't pain, this was something far more complicated than I could have imagined. A misunderstanding, altered perspectives. I realized that my life, the world I was trying to build, had become foreign to me. I wasn't just rejected, I was taken somewhere else where I wasn't. He didn't just choose her, he didn't just take her out of my life, he knew I had no place in that future. Absorbed in these thoughts, I didn't immediately hear Robert come up to me and speak, but his words seemed to pass me by without touching my soul. "Sophie, that's enough. You need to pull yourself together. This is your moment. You can't act like this at such an important meeting," he said, his voice showing no concern or understanding. He spoke as he always did, coldly, without any emotion. He was telling me that I needed to get my face back, as if this was just a temporary setback and not what I was going through at the moment. I sighed and tried to return to this world, a world where I was an important figure, a world where everyone saw me. I realized that I needed to get back on stage, as painful as it was, but I also realized that I would never be the same again. I was no longer the woman who could just smile and forget. I was ruined and there was no way to put it back together. I couldn't just be a part of this game. He finished speaking and I realized that now, no matter how much I tried to get it all back, I was going to have to go through a whole new journey. But in order to do that, I had to forget everything that was holding me back. I tried to take a step forward, but she was still in front of me. Lena, just like before, her eyes were on fire, her body a perfect match for this place. My confidence was gone and I couldn't figure out what to do, but I made a move. "Vivian, come on, hurry up," Robert said, as if bringing me back to reality. To face and get all my questions answered. When I walked into the cafe, I noticed him right away. Jason was sitting by the window, waiting for me. He looked different than I remembered. His face was haggard, his eyes were faded, and his clothes weren't as expensive and stylish as they used to be. He wasn't the same man who once knew how to manipulate people, how to use his power and influence. He was just a man, someone I'd once loved and who'd betrayed me. "You came," he said as I sat down at the table. His voice was quiet, almost depressed. "You were right." I glanced at him, trying to figure out what he meant, but my mind was on other things. "I didn't come here to make excuses for you," I said coolly. "I don't need you anymore. I came for information, and if you want to help, you'd better be honest." He sighed, his gaze drifting away. Jason was a man who, for all his mistakes, was still a part of the world I was about to destroy. But now, he was the weak link that could help me. He began to speak as if he knew I was waiting. "I couldn't understand what they were doing, Vivian. I was just a tool in their hands. You're right. I was wrong, but I know more than you think." I felt my heart race. Every word he spoke was important. I listened to him to the end, knowing that this information could be the key that would unlock all their secrets. And now, in this meeting, I was going to get everything. Jason continued to talk about how he had been used, how he had been deceived. But now, listening to him, I felt no pity. There was only one desire in my soul: justice. It wasn't just revenge. It was restoring the justice that had been taken from me. "They used you as a pawn," I told him, leaning back in my chair. "But you can help me end this game." Jason nodded weakly. I knew his involvement in this case was key. His information about Reed's weaknesses could be what would lead me to victory. We both realized that there was no turning back now. This was a game of survival, and in this game, someone had to lose. He pulled a clipboard out of his pocket and started showing me documents. All the data he was collecting could be used against the Reeds. He told me about the financial schemes, the shady operations that went unnoticed by all but those who were at the heart of this game. And I was one of them. I took the clipboard and scrutinized every page. It was a crucial discovery. I couldn't believe that all of this was happening under everyone's noses. But now I had all the information I needed to destroy them. I felt a confidence begin to grow inside me. I became strong. I became more than just a woman who had been betrayed. I was ready to take on this battle, and I wasn't going to lose. I needed to act quickly to give Reed no time for countermeasures. My plan continued to unfold, and now I was ready for the next step. As we finished the meeting, I realized that things were going to be more complicated than I thought. But that didn't scare me. I was ready, and each day I got closer and closer to my goal. My gaze was fixed on the laptop screen as I checked the latest data Sophia had gathered. We were one step away from uncovering the whole truth. In my hands now was the key to ending the game. I could already envision it all breaking down. The whole thing was in front of me, like a complex mechanism with every piece in its place. The Reeds could no longer be considered invincible. Their weaknesses were hidden in the most unexpected places, and now I knew how to exploit them. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. Everything I did was part of a carefully planned path. Every move, every decision, everything led to the finale, to the moment when the Reeds would finally realize that they no longer controlled this game. It all started when I decided to take the extreme step of sending the documents into the hands of the right people. I knew it wouldn't be an easy step, but I didn't have time to think about it. Time was running out, and I realized that every delay could cost me everything. I was ready. Late in the afternoon, with only the dim lights on the screen and light bulbs illuminating my office, I made my decision. I called Jason, knowing his help was needed. "We are on the cusp of change," I said when he answered the phone. "Are you ready for the next step? Are you sure?" His voice sounded wary, but still with a note of determination. "Yes, we're ready. Everything has to happen right now." My words may have seemed cold to him, but I could actually feel every atom in my body pulsing with determination. I could no longer afford to be weak. I could no longer be just a figure used for someone else's purposes. I knew that this would be the final step, and once it happened, I would never go back. The moment I hung up the phone, I could feel the tension building. All this time, I had been playing by rules that were written for others. But now the rules were changing. I was going to be the one in control of them, and I was ready. I was ready to be the one to put an end to this dark business. I sat in my office looking at the clock. Time was running out, and I could feel the world around me starting to speed up. All that was left was to wait. My body was tense, every nerve on edge. I knew this moment was crucial. It was more than just revenge. It was a moment of truth. I had to lead them to their downfall. I was soon informed that the documents had been delivered, and now there was nothing left to do but wait for a reaction. I knew it would change everything. I sat staring calmly at the screen as if nothing could shake me, but there was a storm raging inside me. I had been waiting for this moment. The moment when everything would turn upside down and Reed's world would collapse like a house of cards. But despite my best efforts, my thoughts kept returning to what I'd experienced. Remembering every detail, every pain I'd felt when Marcus left me. Remembering how insignificant I'd felt. Insignificant when he'd turned his back on me. Unable to see me. I wasn't that woman anymore. I was someone new. I was someone who could fight. And this was a fight I would win. My phone rang again. I picked it up and heard Jason's familiar voice. "It's all set. You need to be there tomorrow. We need to be ready for whatever happens." "I'll be ready," I answered without hesitation. "The time is now. Everything will be finished." He told me that everything I had done, everything I had prepared, was now on the verge of being realized. I knew the moment had come when there was no turning back. I had to see it through. I hung up the phone and felt that determination seep into every cell of my body. I was on the threshold. I was on the brink of my new beginning, my new life, a life where I would no longer be the victim. I would be the one in control of this world. The day I had waited so long for had arrived. All the energy within me was now centered in one moment. I felt no fear. Instead, there was a sense of victory bubbling in my chest. All I had to do was take the final step. Today, I wasn't the person who took offense or felt sorry for myself. I became the one directing events, the one controlling the outcome. I drove to the meeting, feeling the growing determination leading me to the climax. On the road, I repeated to myself that nothing could go wrong. I had thought through every step. I had a plan. I knew how the system in which I had once been a mere pawn had been playing against me all these years. But now I was ready to win. As I approached the building where the meeting was to take place, I noticed how hard it was for me to take the last few steps. My thoughts were already clear, but still, in the back of my mind, I doubted. I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to bear all the consequences. This wasn't just about the destruction of the Reeds. It was a battle with my own demons. Still, I went forward, realizing that this was my time. As soon as I entered the building, I was immediately greeted. Being in the midst of the crowd of people, I felt everything begin to take shape. I wasn't going there to be a witness. I was going there to change the course of events, to put a stop to this story. Slipping inside in my elegant dress and with a cold expression on my face, I made my way to the office where the final negotiations were to take place. My gaze was focused. I wasn't paying attention to the people passing by, their stares. I wasn't looking for approval. I didn't need it. In that moment, I became flawless, like a skillful player who knew when and how to act. When I entered the office where they were already waiting, the whole atmosphere changed at once. I was not to allow myself to hesitate. Everything had to go according to my script. It was important to just wait until the decisive moment. I sat down at the table, and the first question that came out was the key question. "Are you confident in your actions, Ms. Taylor?" One of the lead participants asked, noticing the tension in the air. This could make a big difference in the picture going forward. I looked up, determination in my voice. "I'm ready to go all the way," I answered calmly, but with coldness in my voice. "I know what I'm doing." With each word, I felt the control slipping from the hands of those who had grown accustomed to their power, their confidence beginning to falter. They thought it would be an easy deal, but now they realized they were facing a wall that would keep them from moving forward. My gaze continued to remain firm, even as I met their suspicious eyes. And so, in that moment when it seemed like I should have dropped my mask, I felt incredibly calm. I was ready at any moment to reveal all the information, to gather and connect all the evidence. The documents I had prepared were exactly the leverage I could use for my final blow. I knew that if they tried to slip up or back down, my arguments would be flawless. I was building this in the name of revenge, but also to reclaim what had been stolen from me. When the negotiations began, I immediately laid my cards on the table. I opened the files I'd carefully collected and checked. They tried to defend themselves, of course, but I was prepared for their maneuvers. This wasn't just a victory, this was the moment when I finally became the person who decided who would stay and who would be destroyed. I realized their downfall was inevitable, but they had to see that this was my move, my victory. I directed their attention to the audio tapes, to the emails and documents that contained evidence of fraud, corruption, and manipulation. All those years of playing by their own rules, cheating others, were now a curse to them. These documents, this evidence, was my strongest weapon. I wasn't looking at their reactions. I wasn't interested in their fear. At this moment, I was the one holding the threads in my hands, and I had no choice but to watch their confidence begin to crack at the seams. When they tried to raise objections, I only smiled. It was over. I had won. Their opportunities were gone, and I was the person who was leading the company to revitalization. My heart beat in time with every step. In that moment, I felt no fear or doubt. I wasn't just a woman facing the future. I was someone who was recreating my world, who was straightening out those who thought themselves superior. All this time, I had been building my game, preparing for the final stage. But now I knew. They couldn't stop me. The day I met with them in the negotiating room was the symbol of my new beginning. With every word, I had absorbed their confidence, like I was part of their world. But now I realized that this world had been built on deception, on lies, and it was crumbling before my eyes. I sat at the table watching them begin to realize that everything they believed in was falling apart. It was amazing. I didn't need to make a loud statement. My silence said it all. I knew they saw me as a weak woman to be used and forgotten. But I wasn't that woman. I was the one who now controlled their destiny. "All of this will end today," I said as I began to get clear signals that they were beginning to think about the consequences. My voice was firm and confident. I didn't allow myself any pity. Never again. The men sat in front of me, their faces expressing confusion. That moment when the power slipped away, when they began to realize they had no control over the process. My face was calm. I was in no hurry. I knew victory would be mine and nothing could stop me. When they began to argue, their words became unconvincing. All I had was not only proof, but the power that came from my actions. They were willing to discuss terms, but I knew the negotiations were already over. My victory was inevitable. My hand on the table remained steady, and my gaze was so determined that they could no longer hide their anxiety. At that moment, their confidence evaporated like smoke, and I stood there, surrounded by my plans and evidence. As soon as the talks began, the atmosphere in the room changed. I felt each question and each answer become part of my strategy. I made no sudden moves, but my determination was clearer than ever. I was ready to use all the information I had gathered to show them that they could not get away with it. As I offered them my version of events, as I laid out their crimes and manipulations, I noticed their faces change. That moment when they begin to realize that it is no longer possible to hide and that their lies have been exposed in front of everyone was particularly satisfying. My strength was in my calmness, in my ability to take my time. I knew that this moment would be decisive, that all this time had not been in vain. I laid out everything I had prepared and didn't let them answer right away. My silence was weighing on them, and they could feel themselves losing power. The walls around me began to crumble. Something more than confusion appeared in their eyes. It was fear. But I didn't feel satisfaction. I did not seek revenge. I sought only justice. When one of them tried to justify himself, I simply waited a few seconds and gave my answer. I didn't need words. I knew they understood that I didn't need to explain anything. I was already one step ahead, and when doubt appeared in their eyes again, I knew victory was near. I took their silence as my victory. When the negotiations were over, I didn't feel joy. I felt only relief. I had not only won a victory in business, but also over myself. I was no longer the woman who needed someone else's recognition. I had become the person who was capable of standing behind my principles and destroying other people's worlds if the truth demanded it. Once the negotiations were over, I felt no relief. Everything that was happening was far more important than just winning these deals. I took a pause, looking at their dumbfounded faces. They still couldn't believe I'd handled them so quickly. It was a game with their own rules. Only I knew when and how to use them. The men who had previously thought I was just part of the game now realized that I was the one who would ruin their strategy. They tried to keep the conversation going to look for a way out of the situation, but everything they said was irrelevant. I was one step ahead of them, and that step was fatal to them. When I got up to leave the room, they tried to object, but I didn't even look in their direction. I knew their time had passed. They no longer had any influence over this situation. Everything had been decided. I was ready to end this once and for all. As soon as I left the room, I felt the tension inside me slowly recede. All the years I had spent being afraid and trying to follow someone else's instructions seemed so far away. I wasn't that woman anymore. I was a woman who knew how to not only fight, but to win. And that was my victory. Everything that was happening was becoming clearer and clearer. I was using all of my strength and knowledge to break the system that was trying to squeeze me. In that moment, I felt truly free like I had never felt before. Shortly after I left the talks, I received a call from Jason. His voice was strained, but I knew he was ready for the consequences. He told me that everything had gone according to plan, and now they had to prepare for the next step. We were on our way to the end of this whole game. But at this point, I realized that the game wasn't over yet. Jason and I met a few hours later when the situation started to clear up. He was still the same man who had once been a part of my world, but now he was an associate. We discussed every step that had brought us to where we were today and began to make plans for the future. We were not the people we had once used. We were the ones who were now in control of events. I believed in myself and that everything I did was not only right, but necessary. I had persevered through the most difficult situations, and now it was time for me to decide what would happen next. Jason and I stuck by my side, supporting each other. I realized that only by working together could we complete this case the way we needed to. After meeting with him, I felt the load lifted off my shoulders a little. But there was more to come. Reed still didn't realize who they were dealing with. I was ready for the next step, and I needed to act fast. The next step was to finally destroy their reputation. They thought they still had time, but I knew their time had already passed. Now they were vulnerable, and I was ready to deliver the final blow. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. And now that I felt like I was in control, there was nothing left for me to do but move forward. As Jason and I finished planning our next steps, I felt the world change. I had become someone who was willing to take whatever it took. I am no longer afraid. I will rule this world, and now no one can stop me. When I walked into the conference room, I had no doubt in my mind that this was going to be a defining moment. There was no room for weakness, no room for regret. Everything I did wasn't revenge, it was just justice. In this game where I was up against everyone, I was finally the one controlling the course of events. The hall was filled with people absorbed in their own affairs. Some were discussing the latest news about the company, some were exchanging corporate secrets, but every eye stopped on me as I passed by. I could feel their surprise, their bewilderment. They couldn't understand what was happening. The stares were many, but I felt no danger. I was ready for the encounter that was to end this tumultuous journey. This was the moment when I had to take responsibility for my destiny and for everything that was happening around me. And that moment had come. My gaze met Jason's. He was standing in the corner, trying to hide his anxiety, but I could see his eyes watching me. I knew he was with me. He and I had both been through a lot, and now he was ready to finish what we had started. This moment was the culmination of our plan. I felt the air in the room become thick, as if the whole world had frozen, waiting for what would happen next. With each step, I felt lighter. I could feel the inner tension that had built up over the time begin to dissolve. Everything I did felt natural. I had become that person who was no longer afraid, who was no longer afraid to be me. The auditorium fell silent as I approached the microphone. The anticipation was so intense, you could hear the hearts of everyone in attendance beating. I looked around at their faces, and in that look, I searched for something, looking for signs of regret or even a shadow of doubt. But no one looked at me with sincerity. They were all part of this messy world I once played in. We're all here because our fate was in the hands of those who controlled us, I said, my voice full of confidence. But now everything has changed. In that instant, I realized that these people could no longer manipulate my life. They thought they controlled me, but they never really had the power. And now I had to show them that. I continued to speak without slowing down. This moment is my moment. It's not just the end for those who thought they controlled my life. It's the end for the whole world that tried to bring me to my knees. But I have risen, and now I will stand. My words echoed in the hall. People sat motionless, not knowing how to react. I didn't expect them to applaud, nor did I expect them to cheer. All I needed was to see the realization in their eyes that the game was over. But in that moment, the only thing I felt was liberation. Freedom from all the hidden threats, from the people who were trying to use me. I felt all the pain that had accumulated over years of humiliation and manipulation recede. I became stronger. When I finished my speech, I looked up at Jason, who was walking toward me. His gaze was filled with recognition. We had both been through this journey. We both realized that now our lives would change forever. The light in the hall grew softer. It was as if it symbolized the end of the darkness we lived in. I was no longer the woman who was silent. I was no longer the woman who hid behind other people's decisions. I became a woman who takes responsibility for her life, for her destiny. I noticed most of the people present started talking amongst themselves, whispering, but I wasn't listening anymore. I knew it was already decided for me. I wasn't one of them. I was something more. I could live my life, and in this moment I knew things would only get better. But my victory wasn't complete yet. I had to take the final step. It wasn't just a moment of celebration, but also preparation for the next step. I was ready to face those who were still trying to oppose me. But there was no more fear. I was ready. I picked up my champagne glass, but I couldn't take a sip. The room was filled with noise and laughter again, but I was in a void. Everything that was happening seemed unreal, as if I were watching a movie in which I was playing a minor role. Everyone was talking about what was more important, who would meet who would talk to who, but none of those words touched me. I stood there like a ghost with no voice and no face. Lena moved closer to Jason and their bodies merged in this perfect embrace. I felt the sky darken for me. In that moment, I realized that I couldn't be a part of this anymore. But there was nowhere to leave either. I was drawn into this world, and now there was no turning back. "We'll have a toast," Robert announced, taking the microphone again. But his words didn't matter to me. I continued to stand beside him, feeling something on the inside break. The toast passed, and I felt the world become foreign to me again. Jason, standing next to Lena, barely noticed me. He was standing as if on a pedestal, and everyone present was looking at them. He was happy. Her smile was warm, and their hands intertwined as easily as if they were a couple who didn't need to say anything. I felt myself being pulled downward. I felt like I was falling into a void, but I couldn't help it. My gaze met hers again. I didn't know what would happen next, but suddenly I realized I couldn't continue to stay in this place. I couldn't be around them, be the background that didn't affect their happiness. I was in a shadow, and that shadow was growing thicker with every glance. I sat in my office looking out the window. The evening city, with its twinkling lights and bustling streets, was distant and unknown. I felt my heart clench, and my thoughts swirled more and more in the maelstrom of what had happened at the ball. It wasn't just a fall down the stairs. It was a fall from life, as if my whole life suddenly no longer mattered, as if I was a nobody, insignificant to everyone. Jason, with his troubled gaze and cold determination, disappeared from my world that night, leaving me alone with a heavy sense of betrayal and loneliness. He didn't come back to me after he made his statement in public. He didn't try to justify himself. His heart was with her, with Lena, his first love. He didn't need that marriage, didn't need me. It was just another business move, and I was just part of the deal. I replayed every detail in my head, the looks, the words, the moments when I thought we had a future. But to him, it was just a continuation of the path our parents had set out on, a continuation of the line they were so eager to cross. And me, I was just a part of that future, a troublesome element he didn't need. I stood up, not feeling the time, and walked to the next room. My gaze fell on my laptop. I saw several notifications, reports, data, a few emails from coworkers. I couldn't figure out what to do with it all. I seemed to have lost myself in what I had so often considered my duty. It all seemed foreign now. A letter from my father appeared in the mailbox, and I clenched my teeth. It was the last thing I needed to see, but I opened it. He wrote that we should keep working on the deal, that everything was fine, and that we needed to strengthen our alliance with the Reed family so we didn't lose our strategic position. My hands began to tremble. I didn't want this. I couldn't be a part of this world anymore, a world where I was just a tool for someone else's purposes. My gaze stayed on the screen. I saw his name appear over and over in the messages. How could I face him after all this? My gaze was blank. I couldn't figure out what I should do. The room was quiet, only the slight sound of rain outside the window breaking the silence. Everything around me seemed unnatural, even the air. I looked at my phone again. His number was on the screen again, Jason. A flash of pain went through me, but I didn't pick up the phone. I knew I couldn't. I knew that if I did, I'd end up back in the same quagmire he'd left me in. Every interaction we had now only brought back unpleasant memories. He was no longer the man I shared moments of happiness with. He was no longer the man for whom I could sacrifice something of myself. He was a stranger to me, even when he was standing next to me. I stood up and walked down the hallway where pictures from my past hung on the wall. Everything was just like it used to be. Family dinners, holidays, first steps in business, first meeting Jason. But now I saw those pictures as a reminder of what I'd lost. With each step in the hallway, I felt my heart clench. All this time, I thought life on the other side of those doors would be easier. I hoped that things would be like a fairy tale with him, that we would build something together. But there it was, the truth, cold and inescapable. He was bound to it, and I was just part of the game. My life changed in one night, in one word. I couldn't go back, couldn't play by someone else's rules. I became stronger in my pain. It wasn't what I expected, but it was what I needed to endure. Now I needed to break everything down and start over. The silence in the room was almost deafening. I sat at the table holding my coffee cup, but I couldn't feel its warmth. Scraps of thoughts raced through my head. Everything was so jumbled, and I didn't know how to arrange the pieces to get any sense of what was going on. The night at the gym, the moment I stood there like I wasn't there, all of it was swirling around in my head. My gaze slid back to the laptop screens, where new messages kept popping up. But it didn't matter anymore. I knew that if I continued on this path, if I continued to follow what I had, I would remain the same person I had always been. I was a tool in the hands of people to whom I meant nothing more than a business object. I was part of a world where feelings didn't matter, and I couldn't take it anymore. The ringing of the phone brought me out of my musings. I looked at the screen and saw his name, Jason. What did he want from me? What could possibly be important about this conversation after he'd left me with the full realization that I didn't need him? I slowly picked up the phone. "Vivian, are you there?" His voice was cold, aloof. It was as if he continued to exist in a world that was foreign to me. There was no warmth in that voice, no affection that I had once felt when we were close. "What do you want, Jason?" My voice sounded restrained, but I felt a heaviness rise in my chest. I couldn't go on living in this world of lies and betrayal. I could no longer be the person he'd made me. I just wanted to talk, he said, as if trying to justify himself, but his words weren't working. It wasn't sincere. It wasn't real. He wanted to take back control, to regain his power over me, but I wasn't the one listening anymore. "Are you always like this, Jason? Only when you want something from me?" I felt my words become harsh. "You chose her, and I can't be a part of that anymore." He was silent for a few seconds before he answered. "Vivian, I didn't mean to hurt you. You have to realize that—" "Don't tell me what I have to realize," I interrupted him. "I don't need to. You can't convince me anymore. You've said everything you need to say. I'm not going to live by someone else's rules." And I hung up. I didn't wait for his answer. I couldn't listen to any more of those empty excuses. I couldn't sit in this vicious cycle where he kept pushing, never giving me a way out. All that was left was to move forward. I stood at the window, staring at the soulless lights of the city that could do nothing for me. Everything around me was so foreign. I had to choose my path, and I needed to find it. It wasn't just the loss of a relationship. It was the moment I realized that I no longer had to let anyone control my life. It was the moment I realized that my life was not going to be the same. It was a moment of change, but I didn't know what it would look like yet. Everything around me seemed lifeless. My phone was no longer ringing, and it was as if I was a prisoner of my own thoughts. But inside me, a determination was brewing. I would no longer wait, no longer stand by and watch life go by. I spent the next few days preparing for the change. I wasn't going to stay in this world, in this business, in this relationship. I was ready to fight for myself. I decided that I was going to take care of not only my own business, But I was going to prove to everyone that I could be more than just the daughter of one of the most powerful businessmen. My steps became confident. I reached out to my old contacts. I started looking at job opportunities outside of the circle I had always revolved around. I was no longer going to be just part of this world, this corporate space where I was seen as a thing to be used. One of my old business partners, David, offered me a position in his company. It wasn't just an offer, it was a chance to start over, this time on my own terms, not on the terms of my father or the people who were playing their games behind my back. I walked away from the place I once called home and started building something new. My gaze became hard. I could no longer let these people control my destiny. I began to realize that I had the power to change, that I could not only survive this crisis, but come out of it strong, unbroken. I looked at my phone and saw that there were no messages from Jason. I smiled, not knowing if that was a relief or not. He was part of the past, and I was part of the future. I had made a decision, and it was the most important step in my life. The silence in my office was deafening. I sat, looking out the window where the rain was gently drumming on the glass, and I could feel the energy boiling inside me. Something new had awakened in me, something strong, fierce, and determined. I had lost too much to just fall back into a familiar role, to once again be the woman who backs down when faced with adversity. In that moment, I realized it was time for revenge. My gaze involuntarily slid over the old photographs that hung on the walls. In them, I was different, happy, full of hope and ambition. But that person, that version of me, was gone. I became stronger, but also colder. My world was no longer a world where you could just apologize or turn a blind. I did the obvious. I realized that I couldn't just disappear and start a new life no matter how much I wanted to. My father, my family, everything was connected to this world, but I couldn't just leave everything behind and be quiet. I had to act, to realize what was at stake and use my power to take back what had been taken from me. Revenge. It became my fuel. The first meeting with him was only part of the plan, part of what I had to realize. If I stayed one step ahead, I could turn every step of their game into my victory. I began to think things through carefully, picking the right people, the right allies, and information that could help me expose all of their weaknesses. I realized there was no time to think. My phone rang and I dropped the call without looking at the screen. My father was calling me again, demanding reports, but I wasn't ready to talk to him. All I wanted was to be around those who could help me take steps in the right direction. My mind was focused, and my body was tense and ready for action. I had made a decision. There was no turning back anymore. I know that my father, no matter how much he tried to justify it, was part of this system. But now it was important, not just to disrupt his plans, but to expose all their dirty secrets. Step by step, I moved forward, but each step was like a challenge. I could feel my strength growing. I, who had seemed so defenseless before, had now found my own way. All the steps, all my actions were thought out. I hired people who could help me, financiers, lawyers, investigators. I turned to them only when I was sure that the information or help would really bring the desired result. Every day I became more and more confident. I was breaking new ground in both business and personal relationships. I could fight, and that feeling was becoming more and more real. But despite all my determination, an inner voice told me that I had to be careful. There was danger lurking in every decision, in every step. I knew I had to stay one step ahead of everyone else. I couldn't allow myself to make a mistake. I couldn't allow myself to be vulnerable like when he told me he loved Lena. I had to become invincible. More and more, I immersed myself in planning. I discovered that my strength wasn't just in my ability to manipulate people, but in my ability to manage the situation at every turn. I was teaching people how to act in an environment where everything could be at stake. All those months of thinking about revenge have now become a reality. I started working with professionals who were able to help me uncover all the schemes I was looking for. I went to several meetings where I was able to gather all the evidence I could. The thing was that I was prepared for any outcome. I was gathering my strength and waiting for the moment when all these little pieces of information would come together to form a whole. I couldn't give up on revenge, but I recognized that it required strength and confidence. When the moment came, when everything was ready, I would be ready to strike, but only if it led to the outcome I wanted. That night, as I stood in the middle of the office building, clutching my phone in my hands, I realized that everything I'd been building up over the past weeks wasn't just revenge. It was more than that. It was a liberation. I had become more than just a victim. I had become a force that could destroy anything that stood in my way. A phone call from Jason made me sigh nervously. His voice, when I answered, was full of embarrassment and remorse. He kept talking, promising to do something, but every word he said was redundant. I didn't want to hear him anymore. He wasn't my friend. He was just a part of the past, a part of this world I was about to destroy. You don't understand, Vivian. I really was wrong. His voice shook. No, Jason, you weren't wrong. You betrayed me. You and her. Everything that was disappeared when you left me. I said the words coldly, as if I felt they didn't need to be said, but they were necessary. I had to do it, to forget about him, to forget about what I'd once thought was important. I closed my eyes, feeling my shoulders relax. My purpose was clear. I couldn't allow myself to be weak. Not this time. I was ready to go all the way. I pondered how each step I took would bring me closer to victory. My plan was ready. I knew I had to strike, but each strike had to be precise. Every piece of information I received, every person who was with me, they would all play a part in the end of this game. I couldn't afford to make a mistake. I knew that in this moment, all allies and enemies would be exposed, and I was ready for it. I was no longer the woman who stood beside them. I had become different. My steps became more confident. Over the course of the week, I reached out to new partners and began talking to people who were interested in the information I was gathering. I realized that this step was necessary to build my future on the ruins of other people's ambitions. I could no longer be a part of this world. My father was unaware of my actions. He was too busy with his own affairs to notice that I had begun to act in my own way. And that was my advantage. I could operate covertly, working with those who were willing to change the game. Over the course of a few days, I connected people who could provide information on the Reed's latest deals. Each new discovery made me feel like I was getting closer to my goal. I was discovering more and more weaknesses in their company. I thought about how I could use this to destroy what they were building. I started gathering documents, preparing strategic moves. All I had to do was wait for the moment when I could strike. I wasn't going to let them take everything away from me. I was ready to act any time it became necessary. The more I delved into my plans, however, the more one thing became clear. I was no longer the woman who had once been in love with Jason, with his world. I wasn't the one who could forgive the betrayal and come back. I was a new me, the kind of person who was capable of building her own life based on her own decisions. I sat in my office, pensively looking over the paperwork. Everything that was business-related was now more than just a job to me. It was my path to justice. I could no longer be just a daughter or a fiancé. I became a force that could turn this whole peaceful but soulless wheel. But in order to move forward, I needed to find allies. One of them, Jason, was suddenly a man I could work with. But was he as honest as I thought he was? I still wasn't sure. He was my old partner, but how much could I trust him in this new game? Remembering his face, all I could feel was coldness. But he was willing to help, and his knowledge of Reed's business could make all the difference. Every step was meticulous. I couldn't afford a mistake. That's when my phone rang again. This call could change a lot of things. I glanced at the screen and saw the name Sophia, a financial analyst who worked for the Reeds and was now my ally. We'd started working together, and her information was crucial. She knew weaknesses that I could exploit to bring the Reeds to ruin. "Vivian, I need to talk to you." Her voice was quick. anxious. "You have no idea what I just found out. I've checked everything." "Did you find something important?" I asked, feeling a slight tension in my chest. "Everything indicates that they are really preparing for something big. I think their strategic move isn't what we think it is," she replied. "And your father? He may be much deeper into this than we thought." It was what I expected to hear, but didn't want to hear. It was confirmation that my assumption wasn't wrong. My father wasn't just a liaison between the two families. He was involved in a much deeper way than I could have imagined. But I couldn't stop. After all, everything I was building, all of it, could come crashing down if I didn't make a decisive move. I glanced at the project screens. Everything I was doing was slowly starting to turn into something bigger. I knew that one wrong step and all would be lost, but I couldn't allow myself to doubt. My journey was just beginning, and I was ready to go all the way. Sophia kept talking, but her words sounded like clear signals that were supposed to lead me to a decision. I could feel myself beginning to transform internally. I wasn't the woman who used to sit back and agree. Now I was ready to fight, to expose anyone who stood in my way. My gaze became hard and my thoughts became clear. "I understand," I said finally, interrupting her. "We'll keep looking for information. I want to know everything, Sophia, every move they made. You've done your part, and now it's time to act." I could feel myself gaining more and more control. This business wasn't just about money and deals. It was a battlefield where every move could lead to destruction, and I knew I could win. The task became clear. I had to look for the Reeds' weaknesses, their missteps and mistakes, and use them against them. I knew that my father, for all his influence, was not as powerful as I had previously thought. He was just part of a larger game that others controlled, and in that game, I could be the one to put everything in its place. However, despite my determined mindset, thoughts of Jason were still running through my head. He wasn't part of the plan, but I knew his involvement in this game would be inevitable. He could be useful, but he was also the one who had betrayed me. I realized I couldn't just ignore him. I had to exploit his weaknesses as much as anything else. It was a game, after all, but in this game, no one had to win but me. With each step, I was becoming more and more the one who could destroy this world, this business. I was willing to do anything. Now, I wasn't just a woman who was being manipulated. I was someone who could be manipulated. There came a moment when everything fell into place. I finally realized that I didn't have to wait for the right moment. I had to act without looking back. My plan became more and more realistic and my steps more and more confident. I was setting myself up for a fight and nothing could stop me. I took the first step when I decided I was going to meet Jason. Meeting him was a necessity for me. It wasn't just a conversation with my partner. It was part of my plan. My goal was clear. I had to exploit all of Reed's weaknesses, and Jason could help me. Even though he was the man who'd abandoned me, I knew his connections. His knowledge of the Reed's business were valuable, and I was ready to take advantage of it. The meeting was set at a cafe downtown. I didn't try to hide my face because I knew I didn't need to. I was ready to meet him face.